Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever, worked incredibly hard for a big goal, put in all that effort, crossed the finish line, and then suddenly thought, okay, now what? It's that kind of weird, unsettling quiet after a huge change. Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that feeling, but specifically looking at it through the lens of weight loss. We've been really digging into the insights of Dan Hollis, someone who looks, well, way beyond the scale, right into the heart of identity. The sources you brought in, especially his work like The Store Beneath the Weight and that piece on semaglutide and support, wow, they really made us rethink things. They point to this crucial truth that honestly, most weight loss programs seem to miss completely, a truth that really comes to the surface after the physical changes start.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? How Dan Hollis manages to boil down such a complex journey into this single, really powerful statement. He says, weight loss is biology. Staying there is narrative. And that just hits it, right? This deep dive isn't just about the biological science of it all. It's really about exploring that deep psychological territory that opens up, when the body changes. But that internal story, who you think you are, hasn't quite caught up yet. He really focuses on what happens after the initial win.
Exactly. So, our mission today is to explore that critical after phase. What happens when maybe the constant physical hunger dials down, the scale changes, and suddenly other things start speaking up? These deeper truths, maybe? You might be surprised what you find in that quiet and how vital it is to actually navigate it. So let's get off right there with that killer opening line from Dan Hollis. Weight loss is biology. Staying there is narrative. I mean, for so many of us, all the energy goes into the biology part, doesn't it? The diet plans, the workouts, maybe medications. This quote just completely flips the script on maintaining results.
It absolutely does. And Dan is clear.
Yeah.
The initial phase is often heavily biological. Take something like semaglutide, for example.
Right.
It works biologically, right? Mimics a hormone, GLP-1, tells your brain you're full, slows digestion. It definitely cuts down that constant nagging physical hunger, that noise, as he calls it.
Yeah.
But here's the key thing he points out, and it's so important. Semaglutide doesn't fix you. It gives you space to fix yourself.
Yeah.
So it's not the solution in itself. It's more like, well, he calls it a pause button. A powerful one, sure, but it's essentially creating an opportunity,
Yeah.
a window.
That pause button. I love that analogy. It makes so much sense. It suggests this sort of breathing room, a chance to actually reflect when you're not constantly battling those physical urges. Like the storm finally breaks and you can see clearly, okay, so the physical noise goes down, the space opens up. But what does Dan say actually emerges there? Something maybe we weren't expecting.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. What he observed is it's not always relief that fills that quiet space.
Yeah.
You'd think, okay, cravings are gone, life gets easier. And yes, in some ways. But he warns that this new space often gets filled with confusion, buried stories, and this thing he calls identity grief.
Identity grief. Okay, that's a heavy term. You usually hear about the celebration part of weight loss. Can you break that down a bit more? What exactly is identity grief in this context? Why is it such a big deal?
If you think about it, for many people, their whole life, their daily structure, how they socialize, how they cope, it's all been tangled up with food. Food wasn't just, calories. It was maybe a schedule, a comfort, and an escape, sometimes even a kind of shield, right? So when that relationship with food changes dramatically, sometimes very quickly, it can be incredibly disorienting. Dan shares this really powerful quote reflecting on experiences. The weight came off. Then I realized I had no idea who I was without it. Your body changes, maybe faster than your mind. Your sense of self can keep up. And that gap can lead to this genuine sense of loss, a grief for that old self, even if you know that old self wasn't working for you long term. It's this quiet, often completely unacknowledged emotional fallout that happens way after the initial, hooray, I lost weight moment.
Yeah, you definitely don't see that in the before and after photos, do you? That sort of deep, maybe unsettling silence after the physical change. And Dan makes this really striking claim about what comes up in that quiet space. He says, when the cravings stop, the truth begins. What kind of truths are we talking about here? Does he give examples?
Well, it raises that really important question, doesn't it? What if the weight wasn't just about the physical pounds? What if it was tied up in history, emotions, family stuff?
Yeah.
When that biological hunger quiets down, those deeper, maybe long ignored emotional hungers, they can suddenly get really loud. Dan's point is that people often don't relapse because they're physically starving again. He says people don't relapse into hunger, they relapse into confusion. Maybe the food was filling a void, right? Acting as a stand-in for meaning or comfort or just numbing difficult feelings, loneliness, anxiety, maybe old traumas, relationship issues, even just a lack of purpose. When the food fix is gone, Those things are suddenly right there exposed. It's that lack of a new internal compass, a new story to guide them, that makes people vulnerable to sliding back into old, familiar, even if harmful, patterns they're facing the void.
Wow. Okay, so if that initial physical hunger kind of morphs into this deeper confusion, this confrontation with buried stuff, what do you do then? How do you actually use that space productively? How do you stop that relapse into confusion and build something solid?
Dan's answer is very clear, and it's actually quite practical. He says, you build, you scaffold. And he's not just talking about, positive thinking or pep talks. Those often fade when things get tough. He means creating actual neurobiological replacement structures. Let's break that down. Neurobiological. That's about how our brains form these strong pathways, like roads, for automatic behaviors. Scaffolding is the intentional, conscious building of new roads, stronger pathways for the behaviors you want to replace the old ones. It's literally about rewiring, creating new routines, new rituals, new habits that actively fill the space food used to occupy. You start seeing that old hunger signal, not as bad, but as information is sign that something inside still needs attention, needs naming, needs a new way to be met. And this is crucial. He says, support isn't optional. It's neurobiological scaffolding. It's fundamental. You needed to build this new internal structure for your identity.
Neurobiological scaffolding, I really like that image. It feels
Yes.
so structural, foundational. Like it's absolutely essential, not just a nice to have, but something you need to stay standing and move forward. And he really stresses that this building work, this scaffolding, it's not something you're meant to do in isolation, right?
Exactly. Which brings up a huge point. What happens if the weight goes, the old self feels gone, but nobody ever taught you how to be someone new or gave you the tools for that construction project? Dan observed most people don't fail because the medication doesn't work. They fail because they were alone. So his whole framework is deeply embedded in the idea of community, because community provides, well, shared language for one, accountability, yes, but also critically what he calls narrative memory. By narrative memory, he means the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, our past, who we are now, what we're capable of, what our future could be. These stories massively influence how we act today. Community helps us challenge the old, unhelpful stories and actually co-create new ones. It shifts from just my struggle to our journey. It's about designing new, empowering stories for ourselves, but doing it together with support.
Okay, this whole journey sounds incredibly complex. It's obviously deeply personal, often really challenging, and naturally people are going to stumble. There will be missteps, but so many of us are just programmed to see any failure with weight loss as like a personal flaw, a lack of willpower, proof we're broken somehow. But Dan Hollis seems to reframe this completely differently in a way that feels much more empowering.
Yes, what's really compelling is how he shifts it away from shame and towards seeing it as data, information. Dan looks at failure not as, the end of the road or some kind of moral failing. He calls it a message, a moment of feedback. He teaches that a relapse isn't some betrayal of all your progress. Often it's just the brain defaulting to an old, well-worn path, an old neurobiological rhythm it knows. It's not proof you're inherently flawed. It's more likely an indication that the new support system, that scaffolding you're building, needs strengthening or maybe adjusting. He puts it so powerfully, most people aren't failing semaglutide. They're failing to prepare for what comes after it. They just haven't built that strong internal framework needed for the landscape after the initial weight loss. It's about being prepared, not about being perfect.
Right. So instead of beating ourselves up when we slip, we should get curious. Treat it like gathering intel for the next step. That is a massive mindset shift for so many people, I think. And he has a really pointed quote about shame connected to this, doesn't he?
He does. It's quite profound. He reminds us the shame isn't in failing. The shame isn't pretending you were supposed to be perfect. And that encourages what he calls failing gracefully. It's about building resilience, building grace by responding to a stumble, not with blame and shame, but with a better tool next time, or a new strategy, or maybe just a deeper understanding of what your internal compass was actually signaling. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, it means really asking ourselves actively, okay, what story am I telling myself about this setback? Is it helping me move towards who I want to be? Or is it just trapping me in those old cycles of self-criticism? It's learning how to fail forward, using every bump as a lesson.
So ultimately, this whole deep dive, it isn't really just about weight loss in the physical sense, or even just the immediate psychological bumps. It sounds like it's about completely rethinking what winning even looks like, shifting the goalposts altogether. What does Dan say is the real goal here, the ultimate objective of this whole transformative process?
He sums it up beautifully, I think. He says, this journey isn't about eating less. It's about living more. The definition of success fundamentally changes. It stops being just a number on the scale. It becomes about feeling alive enough, present enough, whole enough maybe, to stop having food be the main thing you measure your life by. It's about reclaiming your agency, finding new sources of meaning, and really tuning into your own internal compass in that space that opens up. Think about what living more really means, right? It's having the mental space, the emotional energy to chase passions, connect deeply in relationships, try new things, contribute, or even just to sit quietly without food being the constant background noise or the go-to solution. It's a shift from a life maybe defined by consuming to one defined by creating, experiencing, connecting authentically. Weight loss can change your body, sure, but he argues only story, only that narrative work can truly change your future. It's about intentionally designing a life that feels genuinely yours.
Wow. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Dan Hollis's insights, there's just such a powerful reminder, aren't they? That any big personal change, especially something like weight loss, it creates this space. And it's really what you choose to do in that space, how you actively work with the silence, the truths that come up, the chances to rebuild. That's what shapes your future. It's about consciously, actively building that new narrative for yourself bit by bit, not just sort of hoping things will magically get easier.
Yeah, and it leaves you with a really important question to reflect on. Whatever your journey looks like, weight, career, relationships, anything significant, ask yourself, what scaffolding are you purposefully building in your life right now to support the changes you're making, big or small? Are you letting that quiet period after an initial success bring you clarity and direction? Or are you kind of letting confusion and old patterns creep back in? Remember what Dan suggests. You don't have to aim for perfection. That's not the goal. But you do need to be prepared to bravely rewrite your story, prepared to embrace that ongoing act of work of building a new, more authentic self.
Because if you're not careful, biology can give you results that psychology will just end up dismantling later on. But with the right tools, the right language, and especially that neurobiological scaffolding you build, piece by piece, you really can come home to yourself, fully, authentically.
Thanks so much for joining us in this deep dive today.